I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time, maybe 14 or 15. I had this really crazy guy that lived on my street. Everyone called him Crazy Mike. And he really was as crazy as you could imagine. But more on him in a minute. I had this one friend that was a little wild. Let's call him Charlie. He was kind of the adventurous friend that got me to do some crazy stuff. We went through a phase for about 2 or 3 months where we hung out a lot, and it was honestly a lot of fun. One of the things we would do is explore the nearby woods. There was a lot of wildlife, and anyone could go out there and explore as far as they wanted. We lived on a mountain, and we would hike up the mountain, and when we had enough for the day, we would hike back down. We normally took the regular roads back down because it was just a little bit easier to get home that way. My friend lived a few roads up from me, so I would walk to his house with him and then go home by myself. I remember this one particular day we had gone hiking through the creek. Bear in mind, it was freezing outside at the time. There was snow on the ground, and a lot of the water was frozen. At one point, we had the bright idea of walking on the ice. As you might imagine, we fell into the water. It wasn't very deep or anything, not even enough to get above our chest wet. But we were dripping with water. And it was about 5 degrees outside. And there was snow on the ground. But being the crazy kids we were, it didn't stop us. We just continued hiking even after we got soaking wet. I don't know if we just had a really high tolerance for the cold or it was adrenaline. We were all good. We continued on for a couple of hours that day. But after a certain point, I finally talked him into heading home for the day. He agreed, and we went out and got on the road. We made our way back down like usual. But this is the point when I started freezing. I was too cold. And I knew my body. I knew that I was in some kind of danger. Like getting near hypothermia or something. When we got to my friend's house, he was more than willing to let me come in and warm up for a few minutes. But just as we were getting to his house, my mom called me. She was really angry with me because I hadn't answered my phone in an hour. I tried explaining the situation to her, but she just screamed at me over and over again to come home. So, I had to walk the rest of the way home, and that was that. This is where Crazy Mike comes in. Because he lives one road above me. And it saves me about 10 minutes of walking if I cut through a part of his property to get to my house. He had a big fence, but so did his neighbor. There was a small walkway kind of area between the two spots. I was obviously in a rush to get back home and warm up. In fact, I was jogging most of the way. I hadn't heard anything about Crazy Mike by that point, so I figured it would be okay if I cut through his property this one time. I started going through, and that was when he came out of his house with an assault rifle. He pointed it at me and started screaming at me like a maniac. Of course, I turned around and sprinted away. I ran all the way back home and told my mom. She thought I was exaggerating and that I shouldn't have been cutting through people's property anyway. That was when I started asking people around the area about him. I heard some stories about Crazy Mike and some of the things he would do. I heard that he was a conspiracy theorist, drug dealer, criminal, felon, and a bunch of other stuff. If I had to sum it all up in a single phrase, a bad guy. Whoever I asked never had anything good to say about him. And the part that freaked me out was that I still had to pass Crazy Mike's house on my way home. I didn't have to cut through his property, but I did still have to walk in front of his house on the road to get to my house. And that made me uncomfortable. Because now, I was constantly worried that I was going to get shot or something. I still would go hiking with Charlie and all that, and after a couple of times of going home, there was no incident. So I thought that was going to be the end of it. However, I noticed something else. He had video cameras on the outside of his property looking out onto the road. I had never noticed them before, but now that I was aware of his insanity, I paid a little bit more attention. Whenever I walked by, the cameras would follow me. What freaks me out the most was that they were manually operated cameras. They weren't the kind of cameras that just follow motion around. He was sitting there operating those cameras every single time I ever walked by. Watching me. I'm not sure if he was recording all the footage or not, but he made me uncomfortable either way. I remember there was one time when I was walking home from Charlie's house at night. It must have been 10 or 11. It was really late. And even then, the cameras followed me as I walked by. I thought that was going to be it. That nothing else was going to happen between me and Crazy Mike. Well, I was dead wrong. It was still during that same winter season. And I was walking home during a blizzard. That was just the kind of guy I was. My mom was going to order pizza that night, and I didn't want to miss it. I passed by Crazy Mike's like I always did. And that was when something unexpected happened. He had this giant fence, and it had to have been 15 foot tall, and it was this really thick wood. Part of it opened up, and a dog ran out after me. I couldn't tell what kind of dog it was, but it was angry and barking at me really loud, and ran after me, and I could tell that it was going to bite me as hard as it could. I got a seriously violent vibe from that dog. I was lucky that I was in really good shape and managed to sprint away. Didn't slip or anything else either. That situation could have turned really bad really fast. Anyway, my family ended up moving a few weeks later for unrelated reasons. My mom actually got a new job in a different state. So that was the end of my experience with Crazy Mike. And even now, I wonder what his problem was. Was he some kind of drug dealer or criminal? Why was he so paranoid about some kid walking in front of his house or cutting through a piece of his property? I've asked my friend on Facebook a couple of times if he's heard anything about Crazy Mike. And apparently nothing has changed. So, make of that what you will. I guess the moral of the story is that you should avoid crazy people as much as you possibly can. Sometimes, just walking in front of their house is enough to set them off. I'm not sure how common the trope of the guy who went to the store to get some cigarettes and never came back is in today's virulent anti-smoking world. However, in my youth, it was still alive and well. Until an incident like this occurred to a friend of mine, I'd always thought it was an excuse mothers used to explain to their children why their father had left them. To my surprise, when I was a junior in high school, I'd discover how true this excuse really was. My friend's dad had been working undercover for the local PD for as long as I'd ever known. Although he would often go extended periods of time without being in contact with his family, they almost always knew he was working a case and would return when he'd completed it. Then one morning, he was just gone. It was a cold and quiet winter day, the kind most folks don't go out in, but he had insisted he was out of cigarettes and would be right back once he'd gotten them. He'd just returned home from a case that had kept him away for over 4 months, and his family was desperate to spend some quality time with him. From all appearances, he'd planned to return, leaving his badge and gun behind. He'd simply thrown on a light coat and drove away into the unknown. The investigation to find him was very hot for a while but would eventually fizzle out. A lot of important questions were going unanswered, mainly from the side of the police department. His wife was stonewalled at every turn, especially when it came to the nature of his cases. The department would only say that his jobs were wide and varied. After not hearing anything new and not getting the answers she wanted for nearly 2 years, his wife hired a PI who used to be a local officer, hoping he'd have an easier time getting the information she wasn't. He agreed to take the case, but she went almost 3 months without hearing from him. Just when she was starting to think she'd been scammed by the man, she received a very important phone call. The PI called her down to his office and gave her all she'd been looking for, and so much more. It turned out he'd certainly been earning his money. Almost an entire month after he'd begun the investigation, he discovered that her husband had been working undercover in the state and, sometimes, national drug trade on and off for 15 years. His most recent case, prior to his death, was undercover in a local meth cooking and trafficking group that had ties all the way to Mexico. When the investigation wrapped up and arrests were made, he went back home. Unfortunately, it turned out that a couple of the people involved in the trafficking end had to be cut loose due to some technicality, and they figured out her husband was an undercover. They discussed this with their connections in Mexico, and said connections demanded they kill him. Generally, in the States, traffickers don't go after cops. It's always been kind of an unspoken rule, but no such belief is held across the border, and in order to maintain a good working relationship, they agreed. It took a short time for them to find the officer and where he lived. Then one cold and quiet winter morning, they caught him on a trip to the store. All this information was unknown to the police until around a year after her husband's disappearance. A jailhouse snitch came forth with a story he had overheard and wanted to trade it for a deal on his case. Once they heard it, he was given the deal. Now that they had the information and some names, the department moved forward by planting another undercover in the organization. Considering what had happened in the past, the police knew the suspects would be very leery, so the officer had to take his time gaining their confidence. He did just what he needed to do and eventually compiled all the proof required to end the trafficking and convict the murderers of her husband. The PI had known all about the investigation for a little while, but was unable to say anything until arrests were made. That morning he had called her to give her all his findings. The arrests had begun, and he was given the okay to let her in on everything he knew. The PI told her in his entire time in and out of law enforcement, he'd never heard of a cop being allowed to stay on undercover work for as long as her husband, especially in a local capacity. A couple of the other narcotics cops told him, off the record, that they had heard that her husband had been asking to transfer out of the unit, but the transfers kept getting blocked. This last tidbit of information was quickly followed up with a reminder that the police department rarely admits when it's at fault for something, and she should give up on the idea of anyone connected to it, accepting any guilt in his death. She took his advice and thanked him for all his hard work. In the following weeks, the remains of her husband would be recovered and given a proper funeral. I attended the service, and it definitely had an air of bittersweetness to it. Everyone had given up hope of him being alive long ago and were just happy to have him back and know what had happened. I would soon go off to college and lose contact with my friend, but I did keep up on the case and was happy to see his dad's murderers were convicted. They have both since been executed, and I hope they're burning in hell. I have a really horrible story from my past. It makes me feel really uncomfortable, and this is probably the only way I can never really tell anyone about it. I had your typical big happy family. Everyone loved each other and everything was really good. Lots of aunts, uncles, cousins, and especially people your own age. There were probably about 30 of us. And we all spent a lot of time together and we were all really close. However, not everyone in the family was a good egg. And here comes my Uncle Ron. He hadn't been in the picture for a long time because he was in prison. I didn't know what he was in prison for at that time. I was young after all. Kids shouldn't know that kind of stuff. He was always kind of the family mess up and everyone tried their best to help him. But from what I've heard, he just didn't want to help himself. People would give him a place to stay, and he would do drugs on the couch. People would try to get him a job, and he would steal stuff while working. That's the kind of person he was. He was getting out of prison right after Christmas. It was really cold. We live in a really cold area and winters are particularly harsh. So, it would have just been a little inhumane to let him fend for himself. Everyone knew that if someone didn't give him a place to stay, he would probably end up back in the system or dead. And as frustrated as everyone was with him, no one wanted to see that. Everyone wanted him to succeed. The adults at least. But I was a kid and I didn't really understand the situation. I was only 13 at the time. But that didn't stop him from giving me some creepy looks. I hit puberty young and already had the body of a young woman, if you know what I mean. I remember him coming over one day when he had first got out. My dad was going to clear out a place for him to sleep in our shed. Our house really was not that big. But if he cleared out some tools and whatnot, there was definitely a good amount of space in the shed for him to stay. Not the most ideal, but it did have electricity and a little space heater. Heck, it was a free place to stay. Hard to argue with him. It wasn't like my dad forced him to stay out there all the time, just to sleep there. I think my dad was trying to protect me and my brother from seeing Uncle Ron high on the couch. About 2 weeks went by, and he seemed like he was changing. He was going for runs and applying to jobs. My dad also seemed impressed. I remember him saying that Ron seemed like he was getting his life together. It wasn't long before he had a steady job and he had some money to spend. One of the first things he did was buy a cell phone, and I remember him asking me to help set it up. Of course, I was more than willing to help, especially being a kid. Technology is one of the only ways I could have helped anyone, and I was excited to do so. He bought a really cheap flip phone, and it really wasn't all that difficult to set up. I almost questioned why he needed help at all. I remember a few minutes after we were messing around with some of the features, he took a picture of me thinking that I wasn't looking. I definitely noticed him take the picture. It was very obvious. That whole situation made me feel really uncomfortable. I didn't really know how to confront him about it though. At the time, I convinced myself that he had just accidentally taken the picture by mistake and he deleted it right after. Despite having a job, he still had a lot of time to hang out and play around. I remember he specifically played with me and my brother a lot. But here's the weird thing that he did. He bought my brother a new gaming console. That must have been at least $300 or $400. He didn't get me anything though. So, whenever he wanted to play with us kids, my brother just ended up playing video games. He was hooked on that thing. I think it was an Xbox. So that just left me and Uncle Ron to play alone. And that was when we started playing a new game. We would fake wrestle. Or maybe play wrestle. I'm sure you know what I mean. When you're a kid and you wrestle an adult and they kind of let you have a chance even though you know they are way stronger than you. Anyway, we started doing that. And it was one particular day that we were play wrestling. And my dad walked in. He got home early from work. And the second that he walked in, he started yelling at Ron. He told me to go to my bedroom and I heard some more yelling. I didn't see Ron the rest of the day. And the very next day, my dad told me that Uncle Ron has to go on a business trip. I haven't seen Uncle Ron or heard anything about him since that incident. But my dad did fill me in on some important information. The thing he had originally been in jail for was sleeping with an underage girl. I guess Ron had claimed that he thought she was 18 and it was just a big misunderstanding. Of course, the family believed him and just excused it as if it was an honest mistake. My dad told me that when he saw him wrestling with me, he didn't believe that story any longer. And that was the second he kicked Ron out of our life for good. Like I said, I don't know where he has been or what he's been up to. But I guess threatening the safety of his kids finally got my dad to cut ties for good.